The year the White Death came for Prospect's Folly, the town was drunk on its own success. Gold dust still glittered in the bottom of pans, the railway was only a 2-day ride south, and the summer had been long and generous. It was 1888, and the future felt as solid and unyielding as the granite peaks of the surrounding mountains. When the warnings began, they were treated as the mutterings of killjoys. Mayor Thompson, a man whose confidence was his primary political asset, stood on the steps of the town hall and laughed. "Another tall tale to scare the children," he'd boomed, his voice echoing across the dusty main street. "This valley has provided for us, and it will continue to provide. We are masters of this domain, not its frightened tenants." The crowd, comfortable in the warm autumn sun, had cheered. But on the edge of town, in a small, sturdy cabin abutted by an unnaturally large and well-maintained barn, a 70-year-old woman named Martha did not cheer. She had heard the same tone of voice once before, decades ago, from a man who promised a river would never rise. She had buried that man. While the town celebrated its dominion, Martha was counting. She counted tins of lard, sacks of beans, and the number of wicks she had for her oil lamps. She was not preparing for a winter storm, she was preparing for the end of a world she knew was built on sand, a world that had forgotten the terrifying indifference of nature. The story of what happened next would not be told by Mayor Thompson. It would be pieced together from the accounts of the few who survived, all of whom would speak of the blizzard with a kind of religious awe, and of the old woman they had once called a paranoid eccentric, as something else entirely. Martha's barn was not a place of rustic charm, it was a fortress of foresight, built over 30 years of quiet, obsessive labor. It began the year after she lost her husband, Daniel, to a flash flood that turned a dry creek bed into a roaring monster in less than an hour. He had laughed at her worry that morning, too. The barn was her response, a silent, 30-year argument with a ghost and the arrogant certainty that had killed him. Every spring, when the thaw came, she would take a portion of her small pension and invest it not in fripperies or comfort, but in permanence. First came the wood. She didn't just collect it, she curated it. She paid loggers for seasoned oak and hickory, woods that burned slow and hot, not the fast, resinous pine the rest of the town used. She stacked it herself, crisscrossing the logs in formations that allowed air to circulate, preventing rot and mold. There were cords upon cords of it, enough to heat her small cabin through 10 winters, filling one entire bay of the barn from floor to rafters. Then came the food. While her neighbors bought supplies week to week from David's general store, Martha bought in bulk, her purchases a source of gentle amusement for the young shopkeeper. "Stocking up for an army, Martha?" he would ask with a smile, hoisting another 50-pound sack of flour onto the counter. She would just nod. Shelves groaned with hundreds of glass jars, the product of every summer's harvest, preserved peaches, pickled beets, spiced apple butter, and rows of green beans suspended in brine. Her hands, gnarled with age, were masters of a chemistry the town had forgotten, the alchemy of turning abundance into security. It was a library of calories, a catalogue of survival. The first official warning came not from a government telegram but from a man named Samuel, a trapper who lived his life by the subtle shifts of the wild. He stumbled into Prospect's Folly in late October, his face etched with a gravity that silenced the usual saloon chatter. He was lean and weathered, and his eyes held the look of a man who had seen something that had fundamentally shaken him. He went straight to the mayor's office, but Thompson was holding court at the general store, so the confrontation happened there, in public. "The animals are gone, Mayor," Samuel said, his voice raspy. "Not moving south. Gone. The high passes are empty. The squirrels, the rabbits, they've burrowed deeper than I've ever seen. The air up high, it tastes like iron. There's a pressure you can feel in your bones. This isn't a storm coming. It's a season of winter hitting all at once." David, the store owner, leaned against his counter, a smirk playing on his lips. Mayor Thompson clapped Samuel on the shoulder, a gesture of patronizing reassurance. "Samuel, you've spent too much time alone with the bears. We're grateful for your concern, truly." But the almanac predicts a mild November. He turned to the small crowd of townsfolk. "This man smells a blizzard in every cold breeze. It's how he makes his living, selling fear and beaver pelts." The crowd chuckled. Samuel's face hardened. "I saw a herd of elk, frozen solid, standing upright in a high meadow. They didn't even have time to lie down. "This is not a breeze, Thompson. It's a hammer. And it's about to fall," but his words were lost in the renewed laughter. He was an artifact from an older, more fearful time. The town had railways and telegraphs and confidence now. They had outgrown men like Samuel. He looked around at their smiling, dismissive faces, gave a single, disgusted shake of his head, and walked out, leaving the warmth of the store for the growing chill outside without another word. Martha had been in the store, buying a small bag of rock salt, and had heard every word. She watched Samuel leave, his departure marking a clear line in the sand. On one side were the people who believed in what they could see and touch, the gold, the railroad, the solid floorboards of the store. On the other were those who understood that the true powers of the world were invisible: pressure changes, animal instinct, the memory of a rising river. She paid for her salt, her face an unreadable mask, and returned to her property. The trapper's warning did not incite her to panic. It was merely the final piece of evidence confirming a theory she had held for decades. That evening, as the sun set in a strangely beautiful, violet-hued sky, she began her final checklist. She moved with the steady, unhurried pace of a ship's captain preparing for a hurricane. She brought 2 of her milk goats into the small, reinforced pen she had built inside the barn, along with enough feed for a month. She double-checked the seals on the food barrels, running her wrinkled fingers along the pitched rims. She inspected the flue of the great iron stove that dominated her small cabin, connected by a covered walkway to the barn. She brought in baskets of kindling, stacking them neatly by the hearth. The town, meanwhile, was preparing for a party. The dismissal of Samuel had turned into a town-wide joke. In the saloon, men were taking bets on how many inches of snow would fall, if any. David sold the last of his fine whiskey. He even sold a bottle of expensive red wine to a young family, who told him they planned to sit by the fire and toast to the great blizzard of '88 that would never come. Through her small cabin window, Martha could see the lights of the town, hear the faint sounds of music and laughter carried on a wind that was beginning to develop a low, mournful moan. It was a sound she recognized. It was the sound of a closing door. The change did not come gradually. It arrived like a thrown switch. At 2 in the morning, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes. The wind, which had been a melancholy moan, became a physical force, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. It was a sound of pure, mechanical violence. The first snow was not flakes, but a horizontal blast of fine, sharp ice crystals that scoured wood and stung any exposed skin. Within an hour, Prospect's Folly had vanished, erased from the world under a churning, blinding torrent of white. The first structural failure was the roof of the livery stable. The weight of the impossibly fast-piling snow, combined with the hurricane-force wind, caused the main support beam to crack with a sound like a cannon shot. The rest of the roof followed, collapsing on the terrified animals within. Then came the windows. The magnificent, single-pane glass front of David's general store, a symbol of the town's prosperity, held for 2 hours before the pressure difference and a flying piece of debris caused it to implode, showering the carefully arranged goods with a million glittering shards. The sound of the town's confidence breaking was the tinkle of the glass, instantly swallowed by the roar of the storm. Inside their homes, people who had been laughing hours earlier were now huddled in terror. The fine, wind-driven snow was like a gas, forcing its way through every crack, under every door, piling in silent, white drifts on their floors. The power died. Not electricity, that was decades away, but the power of fire. Chimneys, improperly swept and unprepared for the downdraft, began to fail. The wind howled down them, extinguishing flames and filling rooms with suffocating smoke and freezing air. The world was reduced to darkness, the roar of the wind, and a cold that felt personal, intelligent, and malicious. Inside her cabin, Martha sat in a simple wooden chair, a wool blanket over her knees. The iron stove glowed with a steady, contained heat. The covered walkway to the barn acted as a buffer, but the main structures were sound. Her windows, small and reinforced with heavy shutters she had bolted hours ago, rattled but held. The only sound within her walls was the gentle crackle of the hickory logs and the rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock. For 12 hours, she sat, listening to the storm dismantle the world outside. She ate a simple meal of bread and apple butter. She checked on the goats. She was not safe, precisely, she was prepared. The difference was everything. It was near dusk on the first full day of the storm when the sound came. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on her cabin door. She rose, her movements deliberate, and peered through the small peephole she had drilled in the thick wood. A shape, crusted in snow, was huddled there. Another, smaller shape was clutched in its arms. She unbolted the heavy locks. The door swung inward, and a blast of Arctic air and swirling snow filled the small entryway. It was David, the store owner. His face, normally so full of easy charm, was a mask of frozen terror. His lips were blue. In his arms was his son, Thomas, wrapped in a blanket that was already stiff with ice. David's wife, Sarah, stood behind him, weeping without sound. "Martha," David gasped, his voice a broken thing. "Please. The store, or the roof, is gone. We're freezing." "My boy," he looked down at his son, who was shivering violently. "We were wrong. Oh God, we were so wrong." Please. For a long moment, Martha simply looked at them. She saw not the man who had mocked her, but the ghost of her husband, Daniel, his face filled with the same shocked disbelief as the river rose around him. She felt a flash of cold, hard anger, the fury of the vindicated. It would be so easy to close the door. It would be just. Her supply calculations were precise. 3 more people, especially a child, threw the entire equation into chaos. But then she looked at the boy, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a fear no child should know. The anger receded, replaced by the familiar, weary weight of responsibility. She had not built this fortress to gloat from its walls. She had built it to survive. And survival, she now understood, was not a solitary act. "Get in," she said, her voice flat. "And close the door. You're letting the cold in." The arrival of David and his family was only the beginning. The faint, steady glow of her cabin's lamp, a beacon in the suffocating darkness, drew others. Within hours, more figures stumbled out of the white maelstrom, guided by the improbable light. Mayor Thompson was among them, his fine coat torn, his face humbled by the raw power he had so arrogantly dismissed. He arrived with 3 other men from the saloon, all of them shivering, their bluster stripped away, leaving only the raw, animal fear of freezing to death. By the second day, 15 people were crammed into Martha's small cabin and the adjoining barn. The cabin was the infirmary and kitchen, the barn, the barracks. The social structure of Prospect's Folly dissolved the moment they crossed her threshold. Here, money did not matter. Political influence was a joke. The only currency was competence, and Martha was the central bank. She stood before them in the lantern-lit gloom of the barn, her small frame casting a long shadow. "There are rules now," she announced, her voice quiet but carrying an absolute authority that no one dared question. "There is no mayor here. There is no store owner. There are only souls who wish to see the spring. You will do as I say." She laid it out with stark simplicity. Rations would be twice a day, a thin stew and a piece of bread. Water would be drawn from the well, a dangerous and exhausting task that would be done in shifts, tethered by a rope to the barn door. 2 men would be on constant duty to keep the path to the well and the ventilation pipe for the stove clear of snow, a Sisyphean task in the relentless storm. Everyone else had duties, tending the goats, portioning supplies, maintaining the lanterns. There was no argument. The arrogance that had defined their town was gone, replaced by a desperate, childlike gratitude. They had laughed at the eccentric old woman and her hoard. Now, that hoard was their universe, and she was its unyielding, unsmiling god. The blizzard raged for 5 days. The external threat was constant, a monolithic wall of sound and cold. But as the days wore on, new, more insidious threats began to emerge from within their sanctuary. The first was the air itself. With 15 people breathing in a sealed space, the oxygen thinned, replaced by the heavy, sleep-inducing presence of carbon dioxide. They grew sluggish, their heads aching. Martha had anticipated this. In the roof of the barn, she had installed a small, shielded ventilation shaft with a rotating cowl that was supposed to turn with the wind. But the ice had frozen it solid. Twice a day, a man had to climb into the freezing loft, tethered by a rope, and use a long pole to break the ice away from the cowl. It was treacherous work. A slip meant a fall onto the hard-packed floor below, and in the swirling snow of the loft, visibility was near zero. They worked in near-total darkness, guided only by touch, their lungs burning with the effort in the thin, cold air. Then, the medical emergency arrived. David's son, Thomas, who had been recovering from the initial shock of the cold, developed a cough. It quickly deepened, settling in his small chest with a wet, rattling sound. His fever spiked. Martha recognized the signs of pneumonia, the winter killer. She moved him into her own bed in the cabin, turning it into a sick room. The town's doctor was among the refugees, but his bag had been lost in the collapse of his house. All he had was his knowledge, which felt terrifyingly inadequate. Martha, however, had her own pharmacy. From a locked chest, she produced dried willow bark to grind into a tea for the fever, and pungent herbs for a poultice. She and the doctor worked side by side, a strange alliance of formal medicine and folk wisdom. For 2 days, the boy's life hung in the balance. The entire barn fell silent, the survivor's own anxieties focused on the small, struggling life in the next room. His shallow, ragged breaths became the new ticking clock, measuring not time, but hope. On the morning of the 6th day, the sound changed. The violent, shrieking rage of the wind subsided, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. After days of constant auditory assault, the quiet was jarring. Martha, who had been dozing in a chair by Thomas's bedside, woke instantly. The boy's breathing was steadier, his fever had broken. She went to the main cabin door and unbolted the shutters on one of the windows. A brilliant, painful light flooded the room. It was the sun, reflected off a world that had been completely remade in white. Cautiously, she unbarred the door. The snow was packed against it, solid as a wall. It took for men, including Mayor Thompson, over an hour of relentless digging with the shovels from Martha's tool store to carve a narrow trench to the outside. When they finally broke through, they emerged into a landscape from a dream. Prospect's Folly was gone. The world was a series of smooth, rolling white dunes, sculpted by the wind into alien shapes. Only the tallest rooftops poked through the snow, which in places was drifted 20 feet deep. The sky was a perfect, piercing blue. The air was so cold it felt sharp in their lungs, but it was clean and still. The survivors stumbled out of the barn, blinking in the dazzling light, their faces a mixture of awe and devastation. Mayor Thompson stood beside Martha, gazing at the buried remains of the town he had once commanded. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked not at the town, but at her. "I called you a paranoid eccentric," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual bluster. "I was a fool. A proud, arrogant fool." He did not apologize further, the words were unnecessary. He simply picked up a shovel and began to dig, not as a mayor directing his people, but as a man with work to do. The hierarchy had not just been dismantled, it had been buried. In the weeks and months that followed, the survivors of the blizzard of '88 rebuilt. They did not rebuild Prospect's Folly. That town, and the foolish pride that named it, was dead. The new settlement that rose from the snow was smaller, humbler, and built with the hard-won wisdom of survival. They called it Martha's Hope. The story of the storm became their founding myth, told and retold until it took on the quality of scripture. The arrogance of the past was spoken of as a collective sin, a cautionary tale for the children. The community changed. They learned to read the signs of the sky and the behavior of the animals. They insulated their homes, reinforced their roofs, and swept their chimneys. Every household, by common agreement, began to maintain a winter stockpile. It was no longer seen as paranoia, it was seen as a civic duty, an act of communal care. Martha's barn was never again a secret. It became the town's communal reserve, its contents carefully managed and replenished by a committee. But everyone knew it was still hers. Martha herself changed very little. She did not become a queen or a mayor. She remained in her small cabin, tending her goats and her garden. But her status had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer the eccentric widow on the edge of town. She was its anchor. Her quiet presence was a constant reminder of their failure and their salvation. People would bring her gifts, a jar of honey, the first vegetables of spring, not as payment, but as tribute. They would ask her advice not on politics, but on things that mattered: when to plant, how to mend a fence, how to prepare for the coming cold. She had spent 30 years preparing for a disaster in solitude, driven by the ghost of a past trauma. In the end, she had not just saved herself. She had saved the people who laughed at her, and in doing so, had given them a future they had not earned, but one they would now spend the rest of their lives trying to deserve.